I discovered my husband had secretly sold our life insurance policy to a stranger 14 months earlier and poured the payout into a failing distillery he'd built behind my back with his college roommate. My name is Odalys, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The email from the mortgage broker was so ordinary that I almost deleted it without opening it. It came in on a Tuesday morning while I was on break at the hospital, the kind of message that looked like every other refinance-related request I had received over the years. We were planning to lower our rate on the house in Asheville, nothing dramatic, just a sensible financial move after years of making payments, and the broker wanted to confirm our current life insurance coverage as part of the paperwork. I remember glancing at the subject line while standing in the break room with a paper cup of stale coffee cooling in my hand, thinking I would answer it in 5 minutes and then get back to the pharmacy floor before my next verification stack came in. I did not know that 5 minutes would turn into the moment that cracked my marriage open. I am 44 years old, a hospital pharmacist, and I had been married to Desmond for 16 years when that email arrived. We have one daughter, Nadia, who was 13 then and is 15 now. For most of those 16 years, I would have described our life as steady, not glamorous, but sturdy in the way that mattered. We argued sometimes, of course. We had the usual marriage friction about chores, schedules, his habit of leaving tools everywhere, my habit of turning the kitchen into an operating room when I cooked. But on the big things, I believed we were aligned. We had bought our house together. We had built our life around our daughter. We had savings, insurance, retirement accounts, and the kind of routine that makes you think you understand the shape of your own future. That is what made the phone call so devastating. If I had been forced to guess, blindfolded, what could have possibly gone wrong with our life insurance policy, I would have guessed a missed premium, a paperwork error, maybe even an administrative lapse by the carrier. I would never have guessed that Desmond had sold the policy behind my back to a stranger over a year earlier. I called the insurance company from my car in the hospital parking garage because I needed a few minutes before going back into work. I told myself I was just confirming details, the way the broker had asked. The representative came on after a short hold, polite in that careful, clinical way customer service people use when they can tell they are about to ruin somebody's day. I gave her our policy number and my husband's name. She paused, then asked me to verify a few details. So far, so normal. Then she said, very gently, that the policy was no longer active in our household. I remember asking her to repeat that because my brain refused to process it the first time. She explained that the policy had been transferred 14 months earlier through a life settlement transaction. A third party now owned it. I was no longer a beneficiary because there was no beneficiary in the way I understood the term anymore. The investor who had bought the policy would collect the death benefit when Desmond died, assuming the policy remained in force. The carrier had simply continued processing the ownership change after the paperwork cleared. I sat there in the car with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel while she continued speaking. She used the phrase life settlement, and I had to ask her to explain it to me twice. I knew the broad concept only because I had once heard it mentioned in passing by a patient's daughter during a discharge conversation, but I had never imagined it touching my own family. She explained that a policyholder can sell a life insurance policy for a lump sum that is less than the death benefit but more than the cash surrender value. The buyer takes over the premiums. The original beneficiaries lose their protection. It is legal, common enough, and in the abstract, completely outside my life. In my life, it meant my husband had sold the financial safety net we had built for our daughter and me. I did not cry immediately. That surprises people when I say it, because they imagine a moment like that must produce instant collapse. What I felt first was a kind of numbness so clean it was almost frightening. I asked the representative if she was certain. I asked whether there could have been a clerical error. I asked whether someone else might have opened a fraudulent policy or confused our file with another family's. She was patient with me, but there was no ambiguity. The policy had been sold. The ownership changed more than a year ago. The paperwork showed Desmond's authorization. I ended the call, sat there for another minute, and then did what I always do when my emotions start to outrun my judgment. I took a breath and made myself think in sequence. I had to go back to work. I had patients waiting for medications. I had to verify. I had a controlled substance count due at the end of the shift. I had a daughter to pick up later. I could not do anything useful from the middle of a parking garage while my hands shook, so I went back inside and finished my shift. If you have never worked in a hospital pharmacy, it is hard to explain the strange discipline of it. People imagine pharmacists as people who stand behind a counter counting pills, but hospital work is different. It is a constant stream of interruptions, urgent requests, dose clarifications, interaction checks, IV admixture issues, transplant meds, antibiotics, pain regimens, oncology adjustments, and the tiny margin between safe and dangerous that you are expected to maintain all day long. That day, every step I took felt detached from my body. I checked doses, I answered questions, I smiled when I needed to. I even signed off on a stat order for a patient in the ICU with hands that looked steady to everyone else. Only I knew I was operating on pure force of habit. By the time I got home, Nadia was doing homework at the kitchen table. I remember seeing her backpack thrown over one chair, her hair tied up in a loose knot, one sock on and one sock off, because she had already changed into her comfortable clothes after school. That ordinary domestic detail nearly undid me. I had been holding myself together by thinking in abstractions, and then I saw my child sitting under the kitchen light, chewing the end of her pen, completely unaware that the safety net under her life had just been quietly cut away. I made dinner. I asked about school. I asked about her math test. I said nothing about the call. That was the hardest part of the first day, not the discovery itself, but the discipline of not unleashing it on the wrong person. I was furious at Desmond, but I was more frightened than angry. Fury can be useful. Fear can make you sloppy. I knew that if I confronted him while I was still drowning in shock, I might miss something important. So I told Nadia her father was traveling for work and would be home in 2 days, and I acted like everything in our world still made sense. After she went to bed, I started pulling documents. We kept a shared file cabinet in the office closet. In theory, it was organized. In practice, it held old tax returns, warranty papers, school forms, home repair invoices, insurance cards, mortgage statements, and a stack of folders I suspected Desmond had not looked at in years. I spread everything across the dining room table. I found our annual policy statements. I found the mortgage refinance paperwork. I found old banking documents and the records for our joint savings account. Then I started looking for any sign of a payout. I was not trained in forensic accounting, but I am a pharmacist, and one thing my profession has taught me is that patterns reveal themselves if you look long enough. You can see the same principle in medication reconciliation. A missing drug, a duplicate order, an interaction, a dosage that looks fine until you compare it to the patient's age and renal function. Once I knew the policy had been sold, I stopped asking vague questions and started hunting for specific numbers. The trail was easier than I expected. 14 months earlier, a wire transfer had landed in a checking account I did not recognize. I checked the bank name, then checked it again, because I honestly thought I was misreading the statement. Desmond had opened a second checking account at another bank without telling me. The deposit matched the kind of proceeds the insurance representative had described. It was not the full death benefit, obviously, but it was a large lump sum, the kind of number that would be life-changing for most families, and should have been impossible to hide from a spouse who shared the mortgage and the household bills. The more I traced, the worse it got. That second account had become a transfer point. Money moved in and out in neat little streams that at first looked meaningless until I grouped them together. There were payments to a business entity I did not recognize. There were withdrawals in amounts that looked chosen to avoid scrutiny. There were deposits and transfers timed around certain dates that suggested the account had been used to patch over something on the brink of collapse. The business was called Blue Ridge Copper Still Co. I remember saying the name out loud to the empty dining room, because it sounded unreal enough that I thought maybe hearing it would make it familiar. It did not. I had never heard Desmond mention a distillery, a startup, a side investment, or anything even remotely connected to spirits production. Not once in 16 years. I pulled the public filings from the North Carolina Secretary of State's website, and there he was. Desmond Kilbride, founding member, 40% owner, alongside 2 other men. One of them was Grover Halloran, Desmond's college roommate. I knew Grover only socially. He had been at 2 reunions and 1 barbecue years ago. Always loud, always charming, the kind of man who seems harmless because he says everything with a grin. The company had been formed almost 3 years earlier. That detail hit me harder than I expected. Not because the business existed, but because it had existed for 3 full years before I learned of it. 3 years of a hidden dream, hidden risk, hidden obligations. 3 years in which Desmond had been asking me about school activities and dinner plans and mortgage rates while quietly building a business that might one day swallow our family finances whole. I dug deeper. The startup had been funded in layers. First, there were withdrawals from our joint savings. Then there was a home equity line of credit I did not remember agreeing to, which seemed impossible because we both knew the house was our largest asset, and we usually discussed anything that touched it. Then I found the document that made my stomach turn cold. A power of attorney I had signed years earlier when I traveled out of state for a certification program. It had been intended for a narrow purpose, something practical and temporary, a piece of paperwork I had forgotten about the moment that trip ended. Somehow Desmond had used it to open the line of credit against our home. The worst part was not only that he had done it, but that he had done it with the calm confidence of someone who knew I would not find out until later. I stared at that paper for a long time. My hands were cold. I kept reading the signature page and the expiration language and the bank authorization language, because the more I read, the more it felt like I was reading a different reality from the one I lived in. I had trusted him with that document because it had once seemed harmless. He had treated that trust like a resource to be extracted. I did not confront him when he came home 2 days later. That decision felt almost unnatural at the time because I am not a patient person by temperament when it comes to betrayal. But I am methodical. In the hospital, if I suspect a medication error, I do not burst into a room and accuse people without knowing whether the bottle was mislabeled, the order was transcribed wrong, or the chart was updated late. I check. I confirm. I document. I ask the questions that matter before anyone starts changing the story. This was my marriage, but the same principle still applied. I knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to move. Before I said anything to Desmond, I made an appointment with a family law attorney and a financial fraud specialist. Her name was Priscilla Ndiaye. She was one of those women who speak with calm precision that leaves no room for self-deception. I brought her every document I had, including the insurance correspondence, the bank statements, the LLC filings, the HELOC paperwork, and the power of attorney form. She spread everything on her conference table and started asking questions that were so pointed they felt almost surgical. Who signed what? When? What exact language was on the power of attorney? Whether I had ever consented to a business loan, whether the home equity line had been discussed in the household, whether the policy had been in Desmond's name alone, whether the premiums had been paid from joint funds. She told me something I did not want to hear but needed to know. The policy sale itself might be legally difficult to challenge if Desmond had been the sole policyholder. The proceeds might technically be viewed as his separate property, even though the practical effect was devastating to the entire family. That did not excuse him, and it did not make the betrayal smaller, but it meant the strongest legal issues were elsewhere. The home equity line, she said, was where things got serious. If he had used an expired or improperly scoped power of attorney to obtain credit against the house, that could be fraud. It could also create a civil mess involving the lender, the title, and our marital property. She warned me not to assume criminal charges were guaranteed. Banks make mistakes too, and if the wording was ambiguous enough, proving intent might be difficult. But she was clear about one thing. I needed to revoke every authority Desmond had ever been given, in writing, immediately. I also needed to separate as much of our finances as possible before any more damage was done. I left her office with a stack of papers and the strange sensation that the floor under my life had become a legal document. By the time Desmond returned from his conference, I had decided I would not let him script the conversation. I arranged for Nadia to spend the night with a friend. I told her it was because I needed to do laundry and catch up on some work, which was not entirely false. I spent the afternoon printing statements, highlighting transfers, and placing them on the kitchen table in piles I thought made sense. One pile for the insurance policy, one pile for the business filings, one pile for the HELOC, one pile for the money trail. When Desmond walked in, he looked tired, sunburned, and oblivious for exactly 2 seconds. Then he saw the table. I watched the transformation on his face with a clarity that still unnerves me. Confusion first, then recognition, then a fast, trapped look like a man realizing that a door he thought was still closed had been opened from the outside. I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I asked him to sit down. He did. I asked him if he had sold our life insurance policy. He did not deny it. I asked him when. He said 14 months earlier. I asked him if he understood what that money was supposed to protect. He looked down at the table and said he did. That was the moment I knew he was not going to insult me by pretending this was some administrative misunderstanding. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew I understood enough now to make lying pointless. He told me about Blue Ridge Copper Still Co. He said the idea had started years ago with Grover, back when they were still talking like men who thought life would somehow leave room for all their old dreams. They wanted to build a craft spirits brand in the mountains, something local and profitable, and, in his words, real. He said he had always believed the business could work if it just got through the next stretch. Every time a hurdle appeared, he convinced himself the next investment would save it. A distribution deal would come through, a regional buyer would bite, a production delay would clear, a lender would loosen terms, a bottleneck would resolve. It never did. He admitted he had not told me because he knew I would question it. He knew I was the one who would ask the boring, important questions about risk, margins, debt, and downside. He knew I would not approve of mortgaging the house for a dream that was already becoming unstable, so instead of asking, he kept moving money. That was the first really sickening thing he said, because it confirmed that my caution had not been a barrier to honest discussion. It had been the reason for concealment. Then he told me the company had failed weeks earlier, quietly, before I ever knew what to look for. Their remaining inventory had been liquidated. Some of it went to suppliers, some of it was sold off at a loss, some debts still remained. The business was effectively dead. I asked him where the money from the policy sale was. He said it was gone. He said it in a way that was almost worse than if he had shouted. Not defensive, not dramatic, just finished, as if he were reporting the weather after a storm had already passed. Gone into equipment, gone into permits, gone into rent, gone into payroll, gone into barrels and copper stills and packaging and storage and the 1,000 small costs that make a startup feel alive right until the day it dies. Gone into plugging the holes created by the earlier holes. Gone into keeping the illusion going long enough for him to convince himself he could recover it. I think that is when I started crying. Not because I was surprised, but because the scale of the loss finally arrived all at once in my body. The policy was not just money. It was the promise that if something happened to one of us, Nadia would not be left adrift. It was the thing I had mentally treated as unbreakable while raising a child. It was a plan we had put in place in practical love. He had turned it into operating capital for a dream I had never been invited to understand. I asked him whether he had ever intended to tell me. He said yes. That answer was almost comically insufficient. Of course he had intended to tell me someday, after it worked. People who hide things always intend, in theory, to tell you later when the truth has become less awkward. They are always just on the edge of honesty as long as the lies remain useful. I told him that if he had sold the one thing meant to protect our daughter and never mentioned it to me for more than a year, then his concept of later was meaningless. He started crying too then, which did not help. I want to be clear about something. Tears do not repair a betrayal. They can make it visible, but they do not fix it. Desmond crying did not make me feel better. It did not soften the damage. If anything, it made me angrier, because it confirmed he understood the magnitude of what he had done now that there was no more hiding behind optimism. Priscilla told me later that the legal reality was complicated. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which meant the division of assets would not be automatic. Because the policy had technically been in Desmond's name as the insured party, the sale proceeds were likely treated as his to use, but the broader pattern mattered. The hidden withdrawals from joint accounts, the HELOC, the misused power of attorney, the undisclosed business obligations, the way he had risked our home and our stability without consent. Those pieces, she said, could support a claim of marital waste or at least strongly influence a divorce settlement if I chose to file. I did not file immediately. That surprised even me. I had always thought that if I were ever betrayed in a way large enough to shake the foundations of a marriage, I would leave. Cleanly, quickly, with my pride intact. I thought I would pack a bag, call a lawyer, and never look back. But when you are the one living inside the betrayal, the choices do not arrange themselves so neatly. They arrive tangled in a daughter, a house, a mortgage, a history of ordinary good years that do not disappear just because one terrible thing happened. They arrive with practical questions. What will Nadia think? What can be recovered? What can be protected? What is anger and what is strategy? So I asked for time. We entered counseling, though "we" is probably too elegant a word for what those first sessions felt like. Our therapist, Dr. Odalys Kessler, specialized in financial infidelity, a phrase I had never heard before and then suddenly could not stop hearing because it fit so precisely it almost felt invented for me. In her office, with its soft light and shelves of carefully chosen books, she explained that hiding significant debts, assets, or financial decisions from a spouse hits the same trust centers as sexual betrayal in many couples. The body does not care whether the secret was physical or financial. The rupture is still a rupture. She was careful not to let us spiritualize what had happened. Desmond wanted, at first, to describe the business as a mistake of ambition. Dr. Kessler cut through that language quickly. Ambition was not the problem. Secrecy was. He had not simply taken a risk. He had excluded me from a decision that exposed our family to loss. There was no noble framing that could make that better. Dr. Kessler also made me see something I had not fully articulated to myself yet. My shock was not only about the money. It was about the fact that Desmond had apparently decided, on his own, that I was not entitled to the same information he was using to reshape our future. He had treated me like someone who needed protection from the truth rather than a partner who had earned a say. After that, every practical thing had to change. Priscilla helped me revoke the old power of attorney immediately. We froze and separated the accounts we could. We created a new arrangement in which almost everything had to be visible. A single joint account remained for household expenses, and even that one had safeguards. For anything beyond routine bills, both signatures were required. At first, it felt humiliating, like we were running the marriage under probation. Later, it felt like the only honest structure we had left. Desmond took a second job on weekends waiting tables at a restaurant near our house. I did not tell people that right away because I was too embarrassed for him and too angry to defend him. But he did it. Every Saturday and Sunday, after his week job, he put on a black apron and served food to strangers while I worked my shifts, and tried not to imagine the life we might have had if he had simply told me the truth 3 years earlier. He put those wages into a separate account in my name. He said it was the closest thing he could do to rebuilding the safety net he had destroyed. The gesture mattered. It also was not enough. That became the rhythm of the next 18 months. Some days I was capable of appreciating the effort for what it was. Other days I wanted to throw the entire account history in his face and ask whether he thought a few months of service work could make up for selling our daughter's future. The answer, of course, was no. Nothing could make it up. But people keep living after damage, and living requires choices even when there is no good closure available. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table doing math I could not stop myself from doing. If that $158,000 had been left alone and invested conservatively, what would it look like by the time Nadia turned 18? What if it had gone into her college fund instead of barrel inventory? What if I had known about the business in year 1 and insisted on stopping it before the debt expanded? What if we had sold the house or cut our expenses earlier? What if? That kind of thinking is poison if you do it too long, but it is also human. I had moments of rage so sharp I could taste them. I had moments where I looked at Desmond washing dishes or folding laundry or coming home exhausted from a double shift and thought about how strange it was that a man could be both the person who had hurt you and the person who was now trying awkwardly and belatedly to help you survive the damage. Betrayal does not always arrive wrapped in cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in competence and familiarity and a history of good mornings. That is what makes it so hard to separate the person from the act. About 8 months into this whole unraveling, Grover Halloran emailed me. I almost deleted the message. His name in my inbox made my shoulders go rigid before I even opened it. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he had known more than he should have. He admitted he had suggested using the old power of attorney when Desmond told him I would never agree to a HELOC for the business. He said he had convinced himself it was a workaround, not a betrayal, which is the kind of phrasing people use when they want to make themselves sound cowardly instead of dishonest. I read the email 3 times. It did not absolve Desmond. It did not even really help. But it added a second layer of disappointment, because it meant Desmond had not come up with the workaround alone. He had had help from someone else who also knew it was wrong. That mattered to me less in legal terms than in moral ones. It told me the secrecy had not been a moment of panic. It was a shared strategy. I did not answer Grover immediately. Later, I sent a short reply saying I had received his message and that I was handling the matter through counsel. I did not invite further conversation. Nadia knew something was wrong before we told her anything substantive. Children notice everything, especially the things adults think they are hiding well. She noticed the new account statements. She noticed that the mortgage conversation had become tense. She noticed that her father was absent on weekends more often than he used to be. She noticed that I was quieter, and that when Desmond talked about money, I now listened like a person on alert rather than a partner who trusted the conversation would be harmless. We made a deliberate choice not to drag her into the details. That was one decision. Priscilla and Dr. Kessler both supported. Nadia did not need to know the mechanics of the policy sale, the home equity line, or the business failure. She needed to know 2 things. First, that her parents were handling a serious problem. Second, that she was not responsible for it. We told her that Dad had made some serious financial mistakes that hurt the family. We told her we were working to fix them. We told her that money stress was adult business, not hers. She asked one night, while picking at the food on her plate, whether we were getting divorced. I remember Desmond looking at me because he did not know how I would answer. I told her the truth, we did not know yet. We were trying very hard not to. Whatever happened, both of us loved her completely. She nodded, but I could tell that the answer had landed in her in a complicated way. At 13, she had not yet learned the adult habit of pretending not to worry. She carried the tension anyway, just in smaller forms. She became more careful around us. She started lingering after dinner instead of disappearing to her room. She asked twice whether everything was okay in a tone that told me she already knew it was not. I spent many nights looking at her and hating the fact that our marriage had forced her to become more observant than I wanted a child to be. The legal issue around the power of attorney eventually turned out to be less explosive than I feared, and more infuriating in a different way. Priscilla and the bank's compliance department reviewed the documents and concluded that the wording was sloppy enough to make a criminal fraud charge difficult to prove beyond a civil dispute. The lender, however, had clearly failed to verify the document's current validity with the care they should have used. That opened a different path. Priscilla pushed hard on the lender's process failure and used it in negotiation. It was not a triumph exactly, but it did result in partial forgiveness on the HELOC debt. That partial forgiveness mattered. It did not erase the damage, it did not bring back the insurance policy or restore the years of secrecy, but it reduced the amount still hanging over our home, and at that point any reduction felt like oxygen. Around that same time, I started to notice that Desmond's remorse was changing shape. At first, it had the rawness of panic. He seemed frightened every time I opened my mouth in case I had decided to leave. He over-explained everything. He apologized too quickly. He tried to tell me he understood, then admitted he probably did not, then tried again. Over time, as the months passed and I did not walk out, his remorse became something less frantic and more disciplined. He stopped asking whether I could forgive him yet, which I had come to hate, because it made forgiveness sound like a deadline. He started asking what structures I needed to see in place so I would not have to wonder. That was the first sign I trusted. Not his tears, not his apologies, not even the second job. Structure. Dr. Kessler told us that if a marriage survives financial infidelity, it usually does so because the betraying partner is willing to live with permanent changes, not temporary punishment. That sentence stayed with me because it cut through all the sentimental nonsense people like to say about rebuilding trust. Trust does not return because someone feels bad enough. It returns when the conditions that made betrayal possible are actually replaced. So we changed conditions. We now had separate accounts for almost everything. We used budgeting software that both of us could see. Major spending required discussion. Any loan, even a small one, had to be disclosed. Our new life insurance policy, when we eventually purchased it, had both our names attached and both signatures required for any change. I made Priscilla help structure it that way, because I wanted there to be no room for creative interpretation. If someone ever tried to move that policy again, it would take paperwork, not memory or verbal agreement. Desmond did not resist those changes, which mattered more than people might think. If he had pushed back, if he had acted wounded by the lack of trust, I do not think we would have made it. But he understood, at least enough to accept, that the old marriage was gone. Rebuilding meant living inside the consequences. My own mother finally learned the full story almost a year after it all started. I had hesitated to tell her because I did not want to hear the disappointed silence I knew would follow. My parents have been married for more than 40 years. Their version of marriage is old-fashioned in some ways, but it is built on fierce loyalty and a kind of steadiness I have always admired. I think part of me had expected my own marriage to look like a modern version of theirs. When I finally told my mother what Desmond had done, I heard a kind of quiet devastation in her voice that hurt more than I expected. She said she was proud of me for not letting rage make my decisions. Then, after a pause, she told me something I did not realize I needed. She said I was allowed to leave. That sentence sat with me for a long time. I had been acting as if staying were the only responsible choice, or maybe the only dignified one. But my mother reminded me that staying can be a decision and so can leaving, and neither one is automatically superior. She was not urging me in either direction. She was simply giving me permission to know I had both options. That changed the emotional weight of everything after that. For a while, I kept thinking I might decide to file for divorce after the next counseling session, or after the next financial update, or after the next time Desmond failed to meet some standard I had not yet articulated. But the date kept moving, and each time I got close to making the choice, something else demanded my attention. Nadia had a school project. The insurance paperwork needed another revision. The lender called back. The accountant needed documents. Life kept insisting on being lived inside the wreckage, instead of waiting politely until I resolved my feelings. And slowly, awkwardly, that became its own answer. Not a clean answer, not a triumphant one, just a real one. 2.5 years after the mortgage broker's email, we are still married. I say that carefully because still married can sound like a simple continuation, and it was not. The marriage I live in now is not the one I thought I had. It is more guarded, more document-heavy, more explicit. There are fewer assumptions, fewer invisible passes, fewer casual blind spots. For some people, that might sound bleak. For me, after what happened, it feels honest. I would not say trust has been restored in the old sense. It has been rebuilt into something smaller and less magical, but also, in some ways, more reliable. I no longer trust Desmond because he is my husband and I am supposed to. I trust what he has consistently demonstrated over time. I trust that he shows me statements. I trust that he no longer treats my questions as insults. I trust that if he is tempted to make a decision with financial consequences, he tells me before the decision becomes real. Those are not romantic things to say, but they are the things that kept us from repeating the same collapse. When we finally bought the new policy, I insisted on a fireproof lockbox for the paperwork. Both names on the policy, both signatures required for change, no exceptions. Priscilla handled the structure and smiled when I told her I wanted the policy itself physically protected in the same way we were now trying to protect the marriage. She said it was a very pharmacist thing to do, and she meant it kindly. I check that box sometimes, not because I am waiting for Desmond to betray me again, though I would be lying if I said the fear had vanished. It has not. I check because I have learned, in the most expensive way possible, that the cost of assuming everything is fine can be enormous. I check because verifying is now a habit of self-respect, not just caution. And I check because I understand something I did not understand before. The opposite of trust is not always suspicion. Sometimes it is carelessness. Desmond finished paying back what he could into my separate account 9 months ago. We did not throw a party. There was no meaningful celebration. He transferred the final amount with the same seriousness he had used for every payment before it. I acknowledged it. I recorded it. We both knew it was not repayment in the full sense. The money had already lived and died inside the business. But the act mattered because it closed a loop that had been open for too long. Grover and Desmond have not spoken since the email Grover sent me. I do not know whether Grover expected forgiveness. I suspect he wanted relief more than absolution. I do not care enough to ask. His silence with Desmond is one of the few consequences I let myself enjoy. Dr. Kessler says she still uses our case as an anonymized teaching example for couples dealing with financial infidelity. She asked my permission before doing that, which I appreciated. In her version of the story, she says, the detail that hits people hardest is not the policy sale itself or even the distillery. It is the lockbox. 2 signatures. Fireproof drawer. Equal access. She says people hear that and finally understand that rebuilding does not mean going back. It means building something new around what survived. That seems right to me. I still think about the moment in the parking garage more than I probably should. The phone in my hand. The engine off. The sharp, sterile light filtering through concrete levels above me. I remember the exact feeling of being handed a sentence that reorganized my entire understanding of my marriage. I remember not knowing whether I was more afraid of what Desmond had done or of how calm I felt while understanding it. That calm turned out to be useful. It gave me enough space to act instead of react. I do not pretend my way was the only way. There are women who would have confronted him instantly and been right to do it. There are women who would have packed a bag, taken their child, and left. There are women who would have locked themselves in a bathroom and sobbed for hours before making a single phone call. None of those responses are wrong. I chose the slower path because my mind needed facts before fury. I needed to know whether we were facing a betrayal that could be repaired or one that required me to protect myself and my daughter immediately from further damage. That is what I discovered by waiting long enough to document the truth. I think people sometimes imagine that the best stories are the ones with the cleanest endings. I no longer believe that. Our ending is not clean. It is functional. It is guarded. It is built on visible agreements, transparent accounts, and a painful amount of honesty. There are scars on both sides. Nadia knows more than she did, though not the explicit details. She knows adults can make selfish mistakes that ripple through a whole family. She knows love does not erase harm. She knows trust can be broken and still, with work, become something usable again. I wish she did not have to know any of that so young, but life does not ask permission before teaching its hardest lessons. The strange thing is that I am not entirely bitter anymore. I am still angry. There are days when the anger rises so fast I can feel it in my jaw. There are days when I look at Desmond and remember the casual confidence with which he turned our security into capital. But there are also days when I see the man who now keeps every financial promise, no matter how small, and I feel something less tidy than forgiveness, but more generous than contempt. I do not trust easily. I do not think I ever will again, in the same naive way. But I can recognize effort that is sustained over time, and I can admit when someone has chosen to change in ways that are inconvenient rather than performative. That does not erase what happened. It simply means the damage did not get the last word. If I have learned anything from this, it is that love without transparency is just a prettier kind of risk. It can feel warm, reassuring, and deeply familiar right up until the moment it isn't. The policy in the fireproof box will not stop grief from existing if something happens to either of us, but it will stop one spouse from secretly deciding alone what the family's future is worth. That matters to me more now than sentiment ever could. Sometimes I think about how little it took to start the unraveling. A routine email from a mortgage broker, a 5-minute task, a customer service call. A policy I had assumed was still sitting safely in the background of our lives. That is how betrayal often works. It hides inside the ordinary until somebody finally asks the right question. And sometimes, because I am who I am, I still hear the phrase I kept repeating to myself after the call ended. Verify, then verify again. That habit did not save the marriage I thought I had. It saved the possibility of the one I have now.